It was the spring of 1775, and General Thomas Gage sat in Boston. He isn't some tyrant. He's a bureaucrat sitting on a powder keg, holding a lit match he is desperately trying to extinguish. To achieve this, he commanded a secret raid, deploying 700 of the Empire's best soldiers into hostile territory. His goal? A surgical strike to destroy weapons and prevent a full-scale war. But waiting for them on a nearby village green are 77 farmers. This is a story of how a police action exploded into a revolution, how a single shot, fired by a hand unknown to history, shattered the British Empire forever. This is the story of Battle of Lexington and Concord. Spring 1775 in Massachusetts, General Thomas Gage, the royal governor and commander-in-chief of British forces in North America, sat in the capital of Boston. He found himself surrounded. You see, Boston was a peninsula, connected to the main line at this time only by a thin strip of land called the Boston Neck. Outside the neck lay hostile country, people who had spent the last decade convincing themselves that their own government was a tyranny. For months, they had been stockpiling. They were hoarding the currency of war: gunpowder, musket balls, cannons, flour, fish, salt, rice. They were hiding the munitions in barns and cellars and burying them in furrows in the fields of towns like Worcester and Concord. This meant that the British Army was effectively bottled up in Boston, watching the rebellion grow like a storm front on the horizon. And Gage was not blind. He knew about these supplies. He knew about the rebellion's leaders. His intelligence network was active and efficient. It was in the late winter of 1775 he had sent 2 officers into the countryside. They disguised themselves as local surveyors. They walked the roads to Concord and Worcester. They sat in taverns, listening to the gossip of the locals. They'd sketched the roads, noting the choke points, the bridges, and the distances. So Gage had a pretty clear picture of the surrounding countryside. Now, the Patriots were not without their sources of intelligence either. The Sons of Liberty, led by Dr. Joseph Warren in Boston, had eyes everywhere. They watched the British officers. They watched the stables. They watched the ships in the harbor. When the British prepared to move, the Patriots knew it almost instantly. And within this stew on April 14th, Gage received secret orders from London. William Legge, the Earl of Dartmouth, who was the Secretary of State for the colonies, ordered him to suppress the rebellion. So Gage decided to act. He would strike at the heart of the resistance's logistics. He would march to Concord, 20 miles west of Boston, and destroy their military stores. He wrote his orders to Lieutenant Colonel Francis Smith. Smith was to take a detachment of the elite grenadiers and light infantry. He was to march with the utmost expedition and secrecy to Concord. There he was to seize and destroy all artillery, small arms, ammunition, and provisions that were found. Gage wished for this to be a secret raid, not a full-scale battle. He aimed for a swift, preemptive strike to catch the rebels completely by surprise. And so it was on the night of April 18th, Dr. Warren received word that the British were preparing to move on Concord. The regulars were gathering near the waterfront. The small boats of the Royal Navy were being readied. This indicated a crossing of the Charles River, a shortcut to Cambridge, rather than the long march over the Boston Neck. With this news, Warren activated the alarm system. He summoned Paul Revere and William Dawes. Dawes was sent over the land route via the Neck to Lexington. Revere was to cross the harbor by boat. But before Revere left, the famous signal was set. 2 lanterns were hung in the steeple of the Old North Church, the highest point in the North End. 1 if by land, 2 if by sea. This signal was not for Revere. He already knew the route. It was a failsafe, a signal to the Patriots across the water in Charlestown, in case Revere was captured before he could escape Boston. The atmospheric conditions of that night were important to understand. It was not a pitch-black night. A waning gibbous moon rose low in the southeast. The moonlight cast a glitter path across the harbor, a spotlight that threatened to expose Revere to the British warships anchored in the channel. Revere had to row silently, slipping through the shadows of the massive hull, right under the noses of the British sentries. This moonlight that threatened Revere on the water would serve him well on land. For once he landed in Charlestown and secured a horse, the moonlight allowed him to navigate the dark country roads. It allowed him to see and avoid British officers patrolling the highway. Longfellow romanticized Paul Revere's ride as a solitary gallop, but the reality was quite different. It was a complex logistical operation of communication. Revere did not just ride, he managed an information network. He rode first to Medford, alerting the captain of the local militia, Isaac Hall. He then rode through Monotony, avoiding the house of the known loyalist Isaac Royal. At every house, at every village, he did not shout, "The British are coming." That would have been ambiguous, as most of the colonists still considered themselves British. He shouted, "The regulars are coming out." The effect was electric. As Revere passed, church bells began to ring, alarm guns, muskets fired into the air, drums began to beat. The sound rippled outward, town to town, faster than the British could march. This was the alarm and muster system the Massachusetts militia developed as a pre-planned rapid response network. Revere arrived in Lexington around midnight. He rode to the house of Reverend Jonas Clark, where Samuel Adams and John Hancock were hiding. He warned them that they were the targets of the British and to leave so that they wouldn't be captured by the regulars. This warning ended up being faulty information, but they weren't taking chances. Shortly thereafter, William Dawes arrived, having successfully navigated the land route. The two men joined by a young doctor named Samuel Prescott, who was in Lexington under the guise of work, decided to ride on to Concord. On the way to Concord, these three riders were intercepted by a British patrol. Revere was captured. Dawes was thrown from his horse, but he was able to escape on foot. Dr. Samuel Prescott, the local man who knew the terrain, well, he spurred his horse, jumping a stone wall, escaping into the woods. He rode on to Concord. It was Prescott, not Revere, who carried the warning to the target of the British raid. While the countryside was waking up, the British expedition was bogging down. Lieutenant Colonel Smith's force consisted of approximately 700 men. These were the best of the best. The grenadier companies and the light infantry companies, stripped from the various regiments in Boston. Well, their evening began with a logistical nightmare. At midnight, they were ferried across the Charles River in heavy naval barges. The tide was ebbing, so the boats grounded in the mud flats on the Cambridge side, far from dry land. The soldiers had to unload off the boats into waist-deep water. I mean, it was April in New England. The air was near freezing, and the water wasn't much warmer. 700 men waded through the freezing muck to the marshy shore of Phipps Farm. And then they stood there. They stood in the freezing mud for nearly 2 hours. Why? They were waiting for provisions to be unloaded. A quartermaster had decided that this was the moment to distribute supplies like ammunition, hard sea biscuits, cold salt pork. I mean, imagine the misery. You're a British regular. You're carrying a pack, a musket, a bayonet, ammunition. You're wet to the waist. Your boots are squelching with ice water. You're shivering. And you're standing in a dark marsh waiting for provisions before you can form up a column to march. It wasn't until 2 a.m. before the column was finally formed and began to move. By then, the element of surprise was dead. As Colonel Smith rode at the head of his freezing, miserable column, he could hear the church bells ringing in the distance. He could hear the alarm guns. The countryside knew he was coming. Immediately recognizing the danger, Smith made a critical decision. He sent a rider back to Boston to ask Gage for reinforcements. Then he ordered Major John Pitcairn of the Marines to take 6 companies of light infantry and move ahead of the main column in a forced march to secure the bridges at Concord. Pitcairn pushed his men. They marched quickly through the dark. They were the advance guard, and they were heading straight for Lexington. You see, Lexington was just a small farming village on the way to Concord, and at its center lies the Green, a triangular patch of common grass sitting in the fork of the road. Captain Johns Parker commanded the Lexington Militia. Parker was 45 years old, a veteran of the French and Indian War. But he was also a dying man. He suffered from advanced tuberculosis. When Revere brought the warning at midnight, Parker ordered the drum to beat. About 130 men gathered on the Green. They were farmers, merchants, fathers, sons. They were armed with fowling pieces, old muskets, hunting rifles. And there, they waited in the cold. But the British didn't appear. Around 1:30, receiving no further word, Parker dismissed the company. He told them to go into the Buckman Tavern, which sat right on the edge of the Green, or go home if they lived close by, but to remain ready to assemble at the beat of a drum. Many of the men crowded into the tavern. They warmed themselves by the fire. They drank. They waited. And it was at 4:30 a.m. that a scout named Thaddeus Bowman came galloping back into town. He brought the news Parker feared. The regulars were close. They were less than half a mile away, and there were hundreds of them. Parker ordered the drum to beat again. The men spilled out of the tavern and the neighboring houses. They formed up on the Green. But this time, their numbers were smaller. Many had gone home to sleep and didn't make it back in time. This time, Parker had roughly 77 men standing in 2 loose lines. 77 farmers against the advance guard of the British Empire. Now, Parker was a realist. He knew he couldn't stop the British Army. He was not there to fight some pitched battle. He was there to make a political statement. He was there to show that the people would not surrender their rights without a witness. He reportedly told his men, "Stand your ground. Don't fire unless fired upon. But if they mean to have war, let it begin here." At the same time, he commanded them to disperse if the troops advanced on them. He wasn't interested in a massacre. It was shortly after these commands that the British appeared. The light infantry came around the bend of the road. They were moving fast, bayonets fixed, their red coats dull in the pre-dawn gray. They saw the militia. The British troops, seeing the armed men, began to shout. It was the terrifying sound, the huzzah of professional soldiers preparing to charge. Major Pitcairn rode to the front. He spurred his horse forward. He swung his sword. He shouted, "Lay down your arms, you damn rebels, or you are all dead men. Disperse, you rebels, disperse." Parker immediately saw the hopelessness of the situation. He ordered his men to disperse. "Go home," he yelled at them. The militia began to break ranks. They started to walk away. But, and this was crucial, they did not lay down their arms. They carried their muskets with them. These were their guns, bought with their money. They would leave the field, but they would not surrender their property. And the moment was chaotic. The British soldiers were tired, angry, pumped full of adrenaline. Their officers were screaming, at times conflicting orders. You had Pitcairn up there yelling, "Surround and disarm." And it was in this chaos that the men began rushing forward. It was at that moment that a shot rang out. Now, history has spent 250 years trying to determine who fired it. Colonial witnesses claimed a mounted British officer fired a pistol. Some said it was Pitcairn himself, though he denied it until his death. Pitcairn claimed he saw a peasant from behind a stone wall point a musket. The gun flashed in the pan, which triggered the British response. Other theories held that a bystander fired from the tavern, or maybe a soldier slipped and his musket discharged. At the end of the day, it doesn't really matter who fired. The crack of that shot hung in the damp air for a split second. Then, the British line erupted. Fire! A ragged volley tore through the morning. The smoke, thick and white from the black powder, instantly obscured the green. Jonas Parker, the captain's cousin, had placed his hat filled with musket balls and flints on the ground beneath his feet. He'd sworn never to run. He was hit by a ball that knocked him down. He struggled to his knees, trying to reload. A British soldier rushed him and ran him through with a bayonet. Jonathan Harrington was shot in the chest. He crawled toward his house across from the green, where he died on his own doorstep in front of his wife and son. In a matter of seconds, 8 men were dead. 10 were wounded. The British soldiers, losing all discipline, charged with their bayonets, shouting and cheering. A frantic Pitcairn rode among them, striking their muskets with his sword, screaming for a ceasefire. "Ceasefire! Form ranks!" It took several minutes to regain control. The smoke slowly drifted away. The grass was stained red. Colonel Smith arrived with the main body of the troops soon after the incident. He found his advance guard disorganized and the village in shock, but he didn't stop to investigate it. He had a job to do. He ordered the band to strike up a tune. The column was reformed and they began marching the 6 miles from Lexington to Concord. The British arrived in Concord at roughly 8 a.m. The sun was up now, and Concord was ready for the regulars. Dr. Samuel Prescott's warning had given them hours to prepare. The militia from Concord and the surrounding towns of Lincoln, Acton, and Bedford had mustered. Even so, when they saw the size of the British force, the 700 men, the militia commander, Colonel James Barrett, ordered a tactical retreat. They pulled back to the ridge overlooking the town called Punkatasset Hill. British Colonel Smith quickly occupied the town. He divided his force. He kept the grenadiers in the center of town to search for the supplies. He sent one company to guard the South Bridge. He sent Captain Lawrence Parsons and about 220 men to the North Bridge. Parsons further divided his forces, sending a detachment to Barrett's farm to hunt for cannon, while leaving a small guard of roughly 100 men to hold the North Bridge. In Concord, the search was frustrating. The colonists had buried the cannon in the fields. They'd hidden the powder. The British found some flour barrels and rolled them into the mill pond. They found the wooden carriages for the cannon, set them on fire near the town's Liberty Pole. They found some wooden trenchers and spoons and burned them. Unfortunately, the fire they set began to spread. The town meeting house caught fire. Martha Moulton, a 71-year-old resident, watched the flames spread. She approached the British officers and demanded they put out the fire. She shamed the soldiers into forming a bucket brigade to extinguish the flames that threatened the town center. Back on Punkatasset Hill, the militia saw the pillar of smoke rising from the town. To them, it looked like the British were burning Concord to the ground. Adjutant Joseph Hosmer looked at Colonel Barrett. "Will you let them burn the town down?" he asked. Barrett looked at his men. There were about 400 of them now. They outnumbered the British guard at the bridge 4-1. So he gave the order: march to the bridge, but do not fire unless fired upon. They formed a column of twos. Leading the way was the Acton Company. The Acton Minutemen were the elite of the militia. They were led by Captain Isaac Davis, a 30-year-old gunsmith. Davis was a man who felt the weight of the moment. Before he left his home that morning, he turned to his wife Hannah and said, "Take good care of the children." He led them as they marched down the hill to the sound of fifes and drums playing the White Cockade, a throwback to the Scottish opposition to the English. Captain Laurie, watching from the bridge, saw the tide of men flowing down the hill. He was in a terrible position. The river was swollen with spring rain. The bridge was the only real crossing. If he lost the bridge, Captain Parsons' company at Barab's farm would be cut off and captured. Laurie ordered his men to retreat to the east side of the river. He tried to pull up the planks of the bridge to stop the militia, but Major John Buttrick, leading the militia column, yelled, "Stop picking up those planks!" The militia kept coming. The British formed a firing line on the far bank. A British soldier fired a warning shot. It splashed in the water. Then another. Then a full volley. The range was less than 50 yards, and the British aim was true. Captain Isaac Davis was hit in the chest. The ball passed through his heart. He spun around and fell dead. Private Abner Hosmer fell beside him, shot through the head. Major Buttrick shouted the order that changed the world. "God damn them! They're firing balls! Fire, men, fire! For God's sake, fire!" The militia volley was devastating. I mean, these men were hunters. They were marksmen. The balls tore through the British ranks. 3 British soldiers were killed instantly. 9 were wounded, including 4 officers. Panic set in and the British line broke. These professional soldiers, outnumbered and facing disciplined fire from peasants, turned and ran. They fled back toward the town, leaving the dead and wounded on the bridge. Upon hearing the gunfire, Lieutenant Colonel Smith rapidly formed 2 grenadier companies and quickly marched towards the North Bridge. En route, they encountered the retreating infantry. Concerned about the isolated companies searching Barrett's farm, Smith pressed on towards the bridge before halting his troops when they encountered the militia positioned behind a stone wall in front of the bridge. A tense standoff ensued for approximately 10 minutes. For 10 agonizingly long minutes, they stared at each other. Smith held his fire, fearing the militia's numbers. The standoff broke only when Captain Parsons' detachment finally returned from their fruitless search of the farm, marching nervously past the silent militia. Colonel Smith saw the numbers gathering on the hill. He ordered a retreat, pulling his forces back into Concord. It was noon. He had been in town for 4 hours, and his men were exhausted. They had marched all night, stood in freezing water, and fought a skirmish. Smith delayed, giving his men a chance to rest. He waited for carriages to carry his wounded. He allowed his men to eat lunch. This delay proved catastrophic. While Smith ate, the countryside mobilized. By the time the British began their march back to Boston, the militia numbers had swelled to nearly 2,000 men. They were coming from towns like Reading, Chelmsford, Billerica, Framingham, and Sudbury. When the British retreat finally began, Lieutenant Colonel Smith deployed flankers along the ridge to protect his troops. And that first mile was quiet. It was about a mile outside of Concord that the road crossed a small stream at a place called Merriam's Corner. To cross the bridge over the stream, those British flankers, that light infantry moving through the fields to protect the main column, had to fold back into the road. It was at this point the formation was compressed, and it was this tactical vulnerability, combined with the converging Colonial militia from the surrounding towns, gave the colonists a significant numerical advantage. And by now the militia were waiting. They were hiding behind the Merriam house, behind the barn, behind the stone walls lining the road. As the British packed onto the bridge, the militia opened fire. It was brutal. The British were caught in a choke point. They took heavy casualties. They turned and fired a volley, but the militia just ducked behind the walls. And it was this moment that set the pattern for the next 16 miles. The fighting on the battle road was not a standard linear battle. It was a fluid, rolling ambush. The British stuck to the road. They had to. It was the only way home. The militia used their knowledge of the local terrain to maximize their advantage. You see, New England is a landscape of stone walls, orchards, rock outcroppings, dense woods, and the militia used these things to their advantage. They would fire from the front or flank, then run through the woods to get ahead of the column and fire again. They created a circle of fire that moved with the British column. They seemed to drop from the clouds, one British officer wrote in his diary. The British return fire was ineffective. I mean, they were firing these muskets, smoothbore weapons that were only accurate for about 50 yards. And these were targets that were at a distance, hiding behind rocks. The situation deteriorated for the British as they approached the bloody angle. This was a sharp bend in the road leading into a lightly wooded area. Here, the militia had established a defensive position on the southeast side of the road, taking advantage of the rocky terrain for cover. Simultaneously, additional colonial forces, having previously engaged the British at Merriam's Corner, positioned themselves to the northwest side, subjecting the British to a devastating crossfire. A second, equally perilous bend, located 500 yards further up the road, brought the beleaguered British into the sights of yet another large militia force. Here, the militia trapped the British in a lethal gauntlet where 8 soldiers were killed. Colonel Smith was shot in the thigh. Major Pitcairn's horse was shot out from under him. It was at this point the British began to run. This was no longer a march. It was a rout. They were stumbling, panting, faces blackened by powder smoke, their coats stained with sweat and blood. As they neared Lexington Green, they were on the verge of panic. Their officers had lost control. They were effectively a mob running for their lives. Pitcairn, fully aware of the dire circumstances, recognized that his men were at the end of their endurance, having been relentlessly harassed by rebel forces since leaving Concord. Something had to change, or they were doomed. All had seemed lost when Pitcairn heard cheering up ahead of him. You see, a full regiment of approximately 1,000 men led by Earl Percy had arrived to reinforce them. Percy's troops had arrived in Lexington just 30 minutes earlier. Hearing the gunfire in the distance, they quickly set up their 2 6-pound cannons and deployed lines of regulars on the high ground overlooking the town near Monroe Tavern. As Smith's shattered column stumbled through his lines, Percy ordered the cannons to fire. Boom! The sound of artillery changed the battlefield instantly. The militia had no experience with cannon. The grape shot ripped through the trees and stone walls. The militia pulled back. Percy opened his ranks and let Smith's men collapse inside the defensive square. They fell to the ground exhausted. At this point, Percy assumed command of the combined forces and allowed them 30 minutes to rest and drink water. At 3:30, Percy ordered the retreat to continue. He placed Smith's beleaguered men at the front of the column and used his fresh brigade as a rear guard. But the militia had not gone away. Their numbers, in fact, had grown. General William Heath and Dr. Joseph Warren arrived, took command. Warren, the spy master, was now a combatant, and the fighting intensified as they entered the town of Menotomy. Menotomy was the deadliest sector of the day. Here, the homeowners joined the fight. The British were forced to clear a path through the town, house by house. Percy struggled to maintain control over his men as many of the exhausted and angry regulars began to commit atrocities in retaliation for their losses at the hands of the often unseen enemy. Officers found it difficult to prevent the soldiers from killing anyone they encountered. One such example of this fighting is the story of Jason Russell. He was 58 years old and lame. He refused to flee. He barricaded his front gate with bundles of shingles. An Englishman's home is his castle, he declared. He stood in his doorway with his musket. The enraged British flankers swept through the yards. They caught Russell and a group of militia from Danvers and Beverly. They drove them into the Russell house. From there, the fighting moved inside, and it was savage, hand-to-hand combat. Jason Russell was shot twice and bayoneted 11 times. He died on his own kitchen floor. 11 other militiamen were killed in the house and yard. The British cleared the houses along Massachusetts Avenue, room by room. They shot men hiding in cellars. They looted along the way. Even so, 40 British soldiers died in Menotomy alone. 25 colonists were killed. It was a slaughterhouse. The sun was beginning to set when the British troops finally crossed the river into Cambridge. Even so, the fighting continued to intensify. Fresh militia units arrived in increasing numbers. It was at this point that Percy faced a critical decision. The road split. Straight led to the Great Bridge and the safety of the Boston Neck. To the left was Charlestown. The militia expected Percy to take the bridge over the Charles River. There, they had ripped up the planks of the bridge and built barricades. They were waiting there to destroy the British. Percy, showing excellent tactical awareness, feinted toward the bridge, wheeled his column left towards Charlestown. The militia was caught completely off guard. By the time they were able to reposition, the British were crossing the Charlestown Neck, the narrow strip of land that led into Charlestown Peninsula. As the British crossed the neck, the guns of the Royal Navy ships of HMS Somerset and HMS Boyne swung around to cover them. At this point, the militia was forced to stop. They could not attack into the teeth of naval gunfire. The British soldiers who had marched to Concord finally reached safety as the sun set, stumbling onto the cover of Bunker Hill. their ordeal was finally over. I mean, these men had been without sleep for 2 days. They had covered 40 miles in 21 hours, 8 of which were spent under fire. The butcher's bill from the day was shocking. The British suffered 73 killed, 174 wounded, 26 missing, totaling 273 men, nearly 20% of the force that left Boston that day. The Americans had 49 killed, 39 wounded, 5 missing, a total of 93 men. The disparity was the most shocking part of these numbers. A rabble of farmers had inflicted nearly 3 times the casualties on professional soldiers. With the setting sun, the British expected the militia just to return back to their homes. But they didn't. Campfires began to appear in a great semicircle around Boston. From Chelsea to Roxbury, the militia dug in. They blocked the neck. They blocked the roads. General Gage was no longer the governor of Massachusetts. He was the mayor of Boston. His authority ended at the shoreline. The siege of Boston had begun. I hope you enjoyed this look at the Battle of Lexington and Concord. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this video interesting or learned something new, please hit the like button and consider subscribing to be notified of future episodes. And if you want to download the maps from today's video or read the full script, they are available now on our new Patreon. The link is in the description. Again, thanks for watching, and as always, have a great day if you want to.